Okay, we've got a full broadcast today, so let's get right to it. I've got some amazing people who were kind enough to take time out of their busy schedules and join me today, and I'm just so appreciative. We've got Dr. Bryant Blount, who is the president and professor of New Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, and they have a site in Charlotte, North Carolina. He received his PhD in New Testament studies from Emory, and he's also currently serves as the president of the Association of Theological Schools. So he's the person we definitely need to talk to about so many of our questions today. He's the author of so many books we all love and know: True to Our Native Land, Can I Get a Witness, his book on Revelation. If you are looking for books on Revelation and similar topics, and he is the person you need to read. He's also is quite a preacher, and he was the 2011 Lyman Beecher Lecturer at Yale. We are so glad to have him. Then we have Dr. Stacey Folyd-Thomas, who is the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair in Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. And she is on leave, but because she's a sister beloved, she took time to be with me today, and I am so grateful. She is the executive director of both the Society of Christian Ethics and their nationally acclaimed Black Religious Scholars Group. And she's the co-founder of the Society for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion. You've seen her books too. She's the author of Mining the Motherlode, Methods in Womanist Ethics, U.S. Liberation Theologies, Beyond the Pale, Reading Ethics from the Margins, Beyond the Pale, Reading Theology from the Margins. And for me, she was one of the outstanding writers for the African American lectionary that people are still using. So I am thankful for her generosity across the years. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Dr. Rapheal Warnock, who is the senior pastor. He's been there since 2005 of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was the youngest person to become the pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church. He received his PhD from Union Theological Seminary, and he's also, you've seen him all over the place: CNN, Huffington Post, the Atlanta Journal, and his book that we are all still using is The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness. So we are just grateful for all of these scholars. Thank them for joining me, and we're just going to get right to it. We're going to just go as long as they will let me today. So let me get right to it and just start with the questions. I'm going to start with Dr. Folyd-Thomas. Dr. Folyd-Thomas, as we look at theological education from when you were a student to now, in your estimation, how has seminary instruction or the teaching of students, how has it changed over the course of your teaching career?
Well, I am a part of, along with Rapheal, that Generation X. And so we were supposedly the first generation for which they said was a generation after God, in that we were asking critical questions about the way in which to reconcile the closing of the American mind, as Bloom would call it, the closing of the American mind, along with the doubting of faith. And the way in which I have seen in my 17 years in teaching within theological education is that it has less of a fulsome sense of Christian identity. So teaching has had to adjust to that reality. And I would say that that was probably something that started with the teaching of the millennial generation. When I was going to Candler School of Theology and taking classes even at ITC and AU Center, the fact of the matter is majority of the students at that time were students who were preparing for ministry, probably safely, maybe around 80% of the student demographic was preparing for ministry, many of whom saw themselves as second and third generation soon to be pastors, right?
Right.
That has changed dramatically. Now I am within, and even within my 17 years of teaching, it has changed. So when I started teaching within theological education in the early 2000s, I think 2002, you saw that you had a Christian demographic that was some maybe 60% preparing for ministry, the remainder preparing perhaps for higher education, actually teaching for the academy in religion or in theological education. But now, just a short 6 to 10 years after that, we realized that the demographic, and President Blount can definitely speak to this in his role at ATS, has shifted to where you see a triad, so to speak. You have 30% that would identify themselves as Christians preparing for ministry, another 30% who are not interested in ministry at all, and another 30% that we call nons, as in N-O-N or N-O-N-E, because they are at best agnostic and more and more often atheists. So the theological education has had to respond to that shifting reality. In other ways, then teaching has to be more inclusive, particularly in ways of sources and methodologies. We have to engage students intersectionally around gender and racial and cultural analysis. Our pedagogical approach is less lecture-based, more interactive. But I think to provocatively get us into a real flat-footed conversation, what I have found from a womanist ethical point of view is that theological education, much like public welfare and the political realm in which we live, is functionally desperate, yet fundamentally detests the very people that they depend upon.
Whoa.
Functionally desperate for, but fundamentally detest or are ill prepared for the people that will save them. So when we look at the mainline religions, for instance, we have mainline religions to the extent in which we think about them today, particularly if we're talking about Methodism, Presbyterianism, Baptism, right? Just as three large swaths of denominations. That to the extent that those denominations are thriving, they're thriving because of Black, Brown, and Asian peoples. I mean, the disciples of Christ, the Presbyterians will tell you, if it wasn't for Korean Christians, where would Presbyterians? Methodists will say the same thing. If it wasn't for the witness of the African American churches, where would Methodism be? The same thing with Baptism, right? That it's the people that we have left behind that are keeping our churches open. The same thing can be said in theological education. It's the people.
So Dr. Thomas, so you're saying that the people who we need to keep our seminaries open, we've left those people behind? Okay, Dr. Blount, speak to that.
Absolutely, and I think the academy has followed the church, and the church has followed the American public. So I think it's not something unique to these institutions. It's something that's systemic of the very water in which we swim as a nation.
Oh my goodness, Dr. Blount, speak to that.
Boy,
what's changed for you?
Well, let me speak directly to her point before I talk about some of the things that changed for me. I want to include the ones that that she had talked about. I think Dr. Folyd-Thomas is right. Inclusion is a key and critical ingredient. The lack of inclusion and how we're able to become more inclusive as theological institutions, that will be critical. The increase in the number of students who are going to seminary is increasing in those particular areas where we have not been as inclusive previously. So we're seeing that across North America. So I think that substantiates the point that she was raising when you look at the data from the schools and the Association of Theological Schools. The places where you're finding the heaviest growth in terms of the number of people applying to and going into seminary, they're people of color and also women. A number of women who are increasing in theological institutions. So again, I just want to affirm that point that she's making. I did an address at the Society of Biblical Literature last year, and a great point of my address was that we need to find ways to be more inclusive in how we teach and the ways in which we teach, to include more radical approaches to biblical interpretation as biblical scholars, so that we support PhD students who want to look more at their own culture as they investigate biblical and theological ideas to build for their dissertations and the books that they're going to write. And in that way, we open up the possibility for equipping a more diverse cadre of professors who can then, I would hope, open up theological education more broadly and more inclusively as well. So I want to agree with that, and I don't want that point to be lost. The only other thing I would add to what I think is different from the time that Dr. Folyd-Thomas spoke about, my time in seminary was different from hers. I'm a generation of the late baby boomers. So I was in seminary in the late 70s and the start of the 80s. And at that point, you were talking, I would agree, you're talking even more so about people who are going into the church, going into pastorates. I'd say 89, 90% of the students in my graduating class from seminary were going toward the church. As I look at seminary now, my own seminary, probably 50 to 60% of the students in each class are thinking that way. Others are thinking about nonprofits. They're thinking about chaplaincies. They're thinking about other kinds of helping careers that may be loosely, tangentially related to what we call the church. So they're using their degrees. There are people who come to do the degree, then go to medical school or go to other kinds of professions where theological thought is helpful for that, but it's not directing them specifically to a church. And the other thing I think that's different from the time in which I was a seminary student is the whole measure of how we find new ways to reach out to students. Students are no longer necessarily leaving their jobs, their places where they used to live, and going to residential theological education. Distance theological education becomes really important. We need to find ways to match the needs of students with the kinds of ways in which we provide infrastructure for teaching. So weekend theological education, residential theological education, distance and hybrid theological education. We need to combine all of those to be able to give students the kind of choices they need, which is very significantly different from the time when I was a student back in the late 70s. Everybody was going, for the most part, they were leaving and going to live in a dormitory and taking their families if they were married and had children. That is shifting dramatically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Warnock, you've seen some of the changes over time. So when we look at seminary education now, and Dr. Thomas spoke about some of the people who it's failing to serve, what's your greatest concern? You've got a full staff of folk who are either been to seminary or going, you've taught in seminaries. What's your greatest concern for seminary education?
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here with you, Dr. Simmons, and also with Dr. Stacey, Folyd-Thomas, Dr. Blount. all people I admire and would enjoy talking to, even if we weren't on this platform.
Amen.
I just, I mean, there are a number of issues, but I want to start with something that both Stacey and Bryant began talking about, and that is this whole, the way in which the demographics really in the nation itself, the shift in demographics in the nation are being reflected in what's happening in our churches and in our seminaries. She talked about how the seminaries need people of color and women to survive. That sounds like the American situation. And so for me, I guess as a pastor, as a liberationist, theologian, the question for me is what kind of teaching and education are those people, are women and people of color, and also members of the majority community receiving when they go to seminary? And I'm concerned that while the demographics of and complexion of the seminary may be changing, the curriculum is moving very slow to reflect that change. What's still what are the things that are still being considered the classics?
Right.
Are the classics still the classics, or do we need to interrogate anew what it means to be theologically educated in this moment? I mean, if you come to seminary in a changing 21st century world, and we're still bowing down to Germany, and as if the only word from God still comes from Germany,
right?
In situation, then we're not really preparing those students to do the work that they need to do as they go out into the world, whether they go into the church or go to work for some nonprofit or some other setting. So I'm concerned about that, and I'm on the board of my own seminary. We're talking about this, examining this. I think it's important for all seminaries to do that. But another thing that greatly concerns me, quite frankly, for all students, but particularly, again, students of color, who, I mean, you know, if we say if America has a cold, Black America has the flu. So you're dealing with people who are coming from financially distressed communities. What I'm seeing is young people are coming to me, interested in working on our staff, and I am just shocked
at the
debt they are in.
That's right.
I cannot imagine where I'd be right now if I'd come out of school, and I'm the first college graduate in my family, so I didn't come from any means, and I had to borrow money to get through school. But a lot has happened again in the country since I finished seminary, and we've got a lot of we've allowed the predatory lenders, as it were, to get into the student debt situation. And so I can't imagine coming out of seminary with a high six figures of debt and planning to go work for somebody's church. And so while I think seminary is critically important and we require it to work on the staff at Ebenezer Church, I would say to any young person or any person, I should say, out there thinking about attending seminary, and we can talk about this as we press on, try to find some they're going into a whole lot of debt, because I'm going to tell you the truth. The church is not, financially, the church is not going to make it worth it. You are going to be in a really tough situation going into a church or going into the academy. I think Bryant and Stacey would agree with me for that matter. Just overloaded with debt.
So Dr. Warnock, you're saying to people in seminary who are want to go to seminary, that for the most part, the church cannot pay them. They can't, the church won't be able to pay them. Yeah, the church won't be able to pay them. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Blount, is he right? Are you all graduating people that the church can't pay?
It's a very good point that certainly the Association of Theological Schools, for example, is very concerned about the debt load that students are graduating with across North America. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He's making the right point. You have to consider, if you have a huge amount of debt coming out of theological education, most people are going into positions, associate pastors, church educators, even solo pastors in small to mid-sized churches. If you're carrying a huge amount of debt, that becomes very difficult to work with, to be able to overcome. You carry it for the extent of your career in many cases. One of the things, I mean, some seminaries are now trying, working in partnership with foundations and in order to try to do both counseling to help students think about the amount of debt that they're taking on while they're in seminary. We at Union are in the we're blessed to have enough of resources that every student now who comes in full-time study, we've committed that they won't pay tuition and fees. So we cover that for them to make sure they don't graduate with debt.
Oh my
That does take a huge amount of resource. That takes a huge amount of resource commitment, but it's so important that we are assigning a great deal of our resources to make sure that we don't
Let me
graduate.
make sure I got you. Let me make sure I heard you right. You're saying that people who go to Union Presbyterian do not pay to go there?
The full-time. So the full-time residential in Richmond, we cover all their tuition and fees, right?
My goodness. Whoa. Okay. Okay. That's wonderful and amazing to hear.
Kind of prophetic leadership.
Yes.
That theological education, because that is not just about commitment and courage. And so the work that Dr. Blount is doing, it's rare.
Right.
It's rare.
Real rare.
A theological education, but it is that kind of insight and that caused me, as a person with too many degrees and a PhD, to literally go back. So I just completed last month an MBA from my first historically Black institution, from Tennessee State University, because I could not get business schools to commit and invest in theological education to help our clergy prepare themselves for financial literacy. Because the fact of the matter is, the pastors that go into mega ministries that can financially support them lack the fiscal literacy to lead effectively, and they give the leadership of their church in the way of stewardship over to CEO, corporate exec types that do not understand stewardship. So it's kind of like Black people when we go to our financial advisor and they tell us, it doesn't make sense to tithe. It doesn't make sense to give all this money to take care of all of your little cousins. And we're like, no, no, no. That's why we have, so we can give. So there's that kind of dissonance that happens between that CEO model of pastoring, where pastors give it over in a mega ministry to these CEOs, what real stewardship is. So we have a lot of pastors, even who are in lucrative pulpits, who are literally giving themselves over to addiction, depression, suicide, because of the burden of the predatory, the predatory, I guess, exploitation, or even shock to a corporate mindset, or the everyday pastor who literally goes into hock to keep the church doors open, or church members who are literally going into hock in order to keep the church doors open. So there is this notion that I think President Blount has illustrated, that we have to allow courage to meet our competence and our community in the way that Rapheal diagnosed, and the prescription that President Blount has done, that we have to be that change agent, or else we will only have seminaries open to the agnostic and the atheist, and we will have no one of faith interested in pastoring coming to the seminary anymore.
Dr. Warnock, so now we've heard Dr. Blount has given an amazing solution, but we know so few seminaries. We wish, and I'm so glad he's on today to talk about what he's doing at Union Presbyterian, but are there other ways that churches, denominations, corporations, etc., how can we help pastors get through seminary without being crushed by debt?
Well,
Are there other ways?
I think we have to have pastors who are thinking about the next generation of pastoral leadership.
Okay.
I was blessed from day one to work with mentors who were deeply invested in my future. I didn't come from means, and in fact, you know, before going to seminary, in fact, I ran out of money my last year of college. I attended Morehouse College, great school, but they don't give you much money. Still don't. We're working on it though. And I remember running out of money my last year, but I had already started interning at a church, even though I hadn't finished college yet. I was at 6th Avenue Baptist Church in Birmingham. And the pastor there, John Porter, was deeply invested in my future. And that church, they had the means. They paid the bulk of the last year of my tuition.
My goodness.
And then after I started at Union Theological Seminary, the other union in New York City, they would bring me down to preach as a seminarian twice a year. He would fly me in Christmas and fly me in once during the summer. And it was really to help me get through school. And they'd raise an offering and help me. And so I said from that moment, as a young 20-something, that when I got to wherever I was going to go and pass those blessings on. And so throughout my whole career, I've always had seminarians working on the staff as interns. Some of them have graduated from being interns to working full-time on our staff. You know some of the folks who are working on our staff right now, Dr. Simmons, and they're doing a fantastic job, by the way. Some of them are your children.
Amen.
There's children everywhere.
Amen.
So I think we need pastors who will invest in the next generation of leadership. And all kind, you know, when you're in seminary, look, you may not be able to cover the full tuition, but when you're in school just trying to make it, you know, a few extra dollars in your pocket helps. And
Amen.
So, you don't have to be a large church. You don't have to be a mega ministry to hire a seminary. In fact, if you think about it, some of the smaller churches that may not be able to afford a lot of full-time staff,
Right.
yet some of the things, it really can be, mutually supportive, because you can get people who are very bright, who, and in many instances, because a lot of people are attending seminaries their second career, they may have a lot of other life experience. In fact, serving part-time.
Right.
On your staff.
Right.
And not just in pastoral roles. Sometimes, you know, if you're interested in going into ministry, just being in the setting, you can learn something. So you might be in seminary serving, you know, doing ministry and pastoral kinds of assignments, but you might also provide some administrative support to a pastor that's just struggling as a solo pastor, trying to make it work as best they can, and everybody benefits. So I would say find ways of investing in the next generation, bring seminarians on your staff. You know, the question nowadays that everybody's struggling with is, what do we do about millennials? How do we engage millennials? How do we get them in the church? How do you get them in the pew? Maybe put some of them in your pulpit.
Amen.
And,
Amen. Amen. And I'm stunned at the number of bivocational pastors who will not just post on Facebook and post at schools and say, I need part-time help from people who are in seminary. And some of it can be paid and some of it might be free. But I'm just amazed that they don't seek out the help of the seminarians, and how often I have to ask, have you ever hired a seminarian? Have they ever interned for you? So we definitely want to encourage that and encourage churches to be more supportive of seminary students. Let me get to some of the other kinds of questions that folk have asked about and said I'm asking, and Dr. Blount, you can start us off here. What do people wish that they had learned in seminary? And Dr. Folyd-Thomas has already said she went back and got an MBA, you know, and I went and got a law degree because I understood how certain things worked in society and in the church. What do you say to people who are saying, and you know, I posted this last week, and oh my God, people posted from everywhere. And the big thing that they said that they're not getting are the administrative tools to understand how to lead a church. They can't write a budget. They don't know how to do grant writing. They don't know how to work cross-culturally with other institutions. So Dr. Blount, what do you say as the president of not only an institution, but of ATS, for students not getting what so many of them said they're needed?
That is an appropriate observation. Let me start by saying that. I agree with the concern. It was a concern I had back in the late 70s. I graduated from seminary in 1981. I was not prepared. I went into a solo pastorate, but I was not prepared in terms of business and financial acumen. That was not a part of the education that I got at seminary. One of the difficulties, as you know, is that there is a huge amount of material and information to cover in a theological education in a very short period of time. 3 years to do a Master of Divinity, that seems like a long time, 3 years, but when you have someone needing to cover all the basics in terms of Bible and theology and ethics and church history and Christian education, you're trying to make it more inclusive. As Dr. Warnock was saying, well, what are the new classics now? So you wanted to make sure that they're not learning what the folk were doing in Germany decades ago, but they're also learning what's happening in liberation context and in cultural context, inclusive context, in the last several decades and the here and now. So there's a huge amount to learn in the theological realm. So then you begin to wonder, well, now how can I also equip in areas where you're talking about conflict management, you're talking about administration, you're talking about business acumen, you're talking about the budgets and all of these types of things. How do you run a church office? How do you deal with the leadership group within a church? All these kinds of issues. We find more and more that within the infrastructure of the seminary or the divinity school, we don't have the time to do that. And therefore, we need to find ways in which we can then help equip students. One of the things we've begun to experiment with is introducing these kinds of concerns as additional courses for students in kind of a workshop format while they're in seminary, and then trying to figure out how we can, in continuing education, work with students in these particular areas where we know they lack capability. So we have a church administration kind of, church administration continuing education program that's specifically geared toward this kind of concern. We can't do it in the 3 years or the 2 years or the 4 years of theological school, but we can find ways to workshop while they're in those years, and then also to think about leadership education and continuing education, because I don't want us to miss how valuable that is. In most professions, law, medicine, business, there are pathways for continuing education, and we don't take that quite as seriously in theological education. And this is one of those places where theological education can build upon what was lacking in the formal coursework while they were in a degree-seeking program.
Okay. Dr. Folyd-Thomas, what's happening at Vanderbilt? What are you all doing? Because I know, you just talked about why you went to get an MBA and what the students needed. So in addition to the 3 years, how are you all helping students to get these things that are just critical, but a 3-year education may not have time to provide? What's Vanderbilt doing in that realm, or even you personally?
Well, I think that what we're trying to do as an institution is to package theological education in such a way that is actually relevant to every iteration of the new generative classes or generations that come through. So we're realizing more and more that doing theological education in disciplinary silos no longer works. I think Rapheal, addressed that.
Right.
There are ways in which we cannot allow the pragmatic parts of what it means to form clergy or form not-for-profit leaders or form seekers or form people who want to become academics. It can't be left for supervised ministry. It can't be left for field research. It cannot be left for the weekend programs that they cannot come to. We have to find interdisciplinary ways. So my colleague Jorg Rieger and I, we just redid a curriculum at the Div School at Vanderbilt, where we have streams and trajectories. And so Jorg Rieger and I are co-convening economic justice. And that's why I went back. Now, it was not required, but that's why I went back and did that MBA. So, because what economic justice means theoretically and what it means pragmatically are totally different. So I'm really trying to invest in a kind of theological education where I'm not forming pastors who pander or professors who patronize. And that is what we've done in our type of leadership.
Yes.
So for me as an ethicist, I think it's important for me not just to do Christian social ethics and just looking at case studies alone or the history of Christian ethics alone, but to talk about what ethical leadership looks like. How do we do the ATS standards requires that we meet 4 standards: religious heritage, cultural context, personal spiritual formation, and the capacity for ministerial leadership in a growing global world. Mm-hmm. So ethical leadership then can actually cover all 4. It should not just be one of those areas. So I can look at case study issues, right? I can look at issues of abortion, for instance, as a typical case study that is a perennial issue for Christian social ethics, but then teach my students how to do qualitative study, ethnographic study, so they can talk about what role that plays in their family services in their church, what role that might play with religious heritage of how they bring scripture and different sacred texts to Bible study, and then talk about how can you roll out a program and a budget for that program, and then to say, how would you put ministers or leaders in those positions? How do you do organizational behavior? So you'll know how to see when somebody who is an NT&J is not going to be able to work with somebody who is an IFSP in doing this kind of program, for instance. This is intentional, interdisciplinary, intersectional work. That's what we have to do. We don't need to do this kind of pandering and patronizing where what it means to be relevant as a professor or a pastor or cool is to wear, Air Jordans, or to allow my students to call me by my first name, or to give
I know
into
you're not having that.
grade inflation.
Why are you talking
No, I'm
about-
just saying that there's certain ways that we try to be.
Yes.
There's certain ways that we try to be relevant, right? To say that we are cool, but that's not what students are looking for.
That's right.
They're looking for ways in which to translate things. And I think that the dire issue for theological education, rather than seeing people or students or the pews as our frustrations, we need to, or people that we should fix, we need to find ways that they can be fulfilled. The divinity school and the seminary classroom should be asking questions that the church must answer. And that is why, even today, many will say, why go to the seminary? Because it's what, and even though that smacks of anti-intellectualism in some ways, in some ways it's a respectful hermeneutic of suspicion. Because if people are called by their churches to go to seminary then and get educated and enlightened so they can help people save souls without losing minds, as my friend Dennis Wiley says, we need to do that in such a way that they don't lose sight of their people when they go to seminary. And I think that's what Rapheal was pointing out.
Absolutely. Dr. Warnock, so Dr. Folyd-Thomas and Dr. Blount have talked about all of the things that are changing, the shifting, what we need to do to really help people get educated. One of the things I always wonder about, and I'm just going to throw this out there, is it possible for theological education to not be in bondage to the same forces of white supremacy that enthrall most of the rest of the church, so that we become siloed on our issues. We only push certain theology. We're divided around certain kinds of issues. And I would argue that it's because of the role of white supremacy. So how does theological education go forward so that it's not in bondage to the same thing?
Well, I think you first have to recognize that the default position is in fact white supremacy.
My goodness.
So you're not going to have anything other than that without a great deal of intentionality. You got to be intentional. You got to be strategic. You got to ask.
So wait a minute. Let me stop you. You said the default position in seminary education is white supremacy.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the 400th anniversary. Everybody's talking about 1619, and I know it was obviously that history is more complicated than that.
Exactly.
But as we press through this conversation about theological education, let us acknowledge that slavery would not and could not have lasted as long as it did without the church's active support and sacralization of the institution of slavery. So when we talk about the meaning of the gospel, when we talk about who's getting educated and what does the education look like, what's the content of theological education, I think it's important for folks to understand, even, you're talking to a group of academics and preachers, that this is not just a theoretical exercise for us.
Right.
The gospel and the meaning of the gospel is for all people, I would argue, but especially for oppressed people, a matter of life and death. Yeah. And Black Christianity was actually born asking the faith critical questions from the peculiar standpoint of being a people enslaved, about the meaning of the faith. Our faith, our voice as the church, as the Black church, the anti-slavery church, came within the context of a Christian slavocracy. If ever there was an oxymoron,
my goodness,
that one had to contend with and negotiate and figure out, it was this idea of a Christian slavocracy. And so this divide, this double consciousness in American Christianity that then gets passed on to Black Christianity itself, it doesn't get unpacked and corrected without a whole lot of work. And so I think we've been having this conversation among us because we operate in a particular circle. But I don't want us to make too many assumptions as we tell people to go and pursue theological education, because quite frankly, depending on where you go, you might end up worse.
Oh my goodness.
The education might do more damage. And I'm not saying that from a position of anti-intellectualism as someone who got a PhD from Union Seminary. I'm saying that, let's say some things that are basic to us. And that is that seminary is not the same thing as Bible school.
Yeah, but I think you're also saying you got to be careful about what school you pick.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you need to know something about the school rather than just saying this is the closest one to my house.
That's right. Some can do more damage.
A great deal of damage.
The hard work that we've had to do as Black Christians is we've had to push against the uncritical consciousness, the evangelical impulses of the American empire. And the Black church has been a countervailing witness against this assumption that divides bodies and souls, the idea of spiritual freedom and socio-political freedom, issues that I worked through in my book, shameless plug, The Divided Mind of the Black Church. That's not a plug, but if you wanted this on Amazon.com.
It's a wonderful resource.
That's right.
It really is.
But that divide sits at the heart of Christianity. Let me just say this quickly. And I've been a pastor now, a senior pastor for almost 20 years now. And, yesterday I preached a parable that I've heard my whole life. And I'm doing this series called Give It Your Best Shot. So yesterday I decided to, as prayerfully, I'd work with this parable of the talents. Very familiar passage. And Dr. Blount will appreciate this. If I thought about it, I should have called him, because I struggled with that parable all week, because coming to it with a different kind of consciousness and actually reading it rather than just sort of thinking you know it,
Right.
All that language in the Luke version of that text, Luke 19 and Matthew 25, which is what I ended up preaching, about this slave master, this man who goes on a journey and comes and calls his slaves. And as a pastor who's concerned about the health and the well-being of my people, I struggled all week, not sure if I could even preach that passage. That
right.
With slavery and with a kind of matter of factness. And much of my work in getting prepared for the message, and people can decide whether they thought I did a good job or not. But at least I had the tools.
Right.
The tools to ask, well, now what are you going to do about the way Matthew deals with this idea of slave? And at one point, the man who goes away says, "You wicked and lazy slave." Those words have import for oppressed communities. There's a history of interpretation of those texts. And
right.
Before I deal with, I had to wrestle with all of that. We got a lot of folks who depending on where you go to school, depending on what circles you're in and the questions your friends are asking you, you may not wrestle with that at all.
At all, yes.
Might be doing a whole lot of damage,
right,
to your own people. And so so the wonderful thing for me about my theological education is that it provided a context in which I could have the space and the tools to learn how to think theologically. I think there are too many preachers who are simply focused on how they sound, simply focused on their style.
That's right.
Simply focused on, Doc, did you slay them? Did you slay the whole house? And simply obsessed with whatever.
Doc, did you slay them on Sunday?
Yeah, did you slay them?
Did you slay them on Sunday? I think, Dr. Warnock, you've hit some very important and critical points. And I just want to say one more time for those who are thinking about going to seminary, especially older adults, second career people, pay close attention to the seminary that you're going to attend. We've got several seminaries out here now who are paying for you to go to their schools. And these are evangelical schools. And I don't care if you're evangelical. I care if they are supportive of your community and your people. Not
the issue is your definition of what it means to be an evangelical. The other thing
exactly.
is, as we consider
absolutely, thank you.
As we consider Dr. Folyd-Thomas and Dr. Blount and so many of my friends, as a result of the work of a whole generation of Black scholars, led in large measure by James Cone, I have to lift that name up, and so many others, Dolores Williams and so many others, you now have a couple of generations of brilliant Christian ethicists and Bible scholars and church historians, people like my friends who are on this platform. And so part of what you want to look at is who's on the faculty at those schools, because you can go to a majority school, but you can have the benefit of studying and being mentored by some of our bright minds who are bringing the questions of our particular experience to the work of theological critical inquiry. Finally, let me say this. I attended an undergrad at HBCU. I didn't go to a Black seminary. There are only a few Black seminaries. We need more. I just want to say to folks who are the alums of those schools, folks who are in leadership in those schools, that we need our Black seminaries to really think about what it's going to take to thrive in this moment. And we're going to have to ask the hard questions, the way Ben Mays and others asked in another generation. The solutions that they came up with will not necessarily fit and work in the 21st century. Anytime Andover Newton Theological Seminary, which was the oldest independent seminary.
Right, that's right.
Closed, merged with Yale, basically closed. And with all of the resources that that community has, I'm not sure why Black people think that we can split $5 6 different ways.
Amen.
And
Amen.
we're going to have to ask some hard questions about how we keep these schools open, keep them relevant, and keep them engaged in ways that will liberate our people.
Yeah. That being said, Dr. Blount, I'm gonna go around to all of you as we get ready to wrap up, and say to everyone listening, these are the voices that we have available in our community, and these are the kinds of people you need to call upon when you want to talk about and write about and bring to your churches and your conferences the voice of theological education. These are the kinds of voices that you need to bring, especially for those of you who do conferences, yearly associational gatherings. These are the kinds of voices that will tell you the truth and tell you in depth what is going on. So I want to close by asking this question and just go around, and I'm going to start with Dr. Blount. When you talk about if you had the 2 biggest obstacles right now to theological education and your 2 answers, 2 biggest obstacles, your 2 answers.
Oh, well, I'd say the 2 biggest obstacles will be where the church is and what the church wants to be, because a great deal of our applicant pool, the people who want to go to seminary, come from the churches. The identity of the church and what the church is going to look like in the next several decades. The church deciding who and what it wants to be. That will have a significant impact on theological education because we draw our students from those churches to equip them for those churches. But also we're trying to figure out in theological education, are we addressing the needs of the churches, or are we trying to help the churches see into a future they themselves cannot yet see? You know, one of the gifts of theological education is we have opportunity to reflect, to think, to write, and to perceive how God is moving in the world, and to see it in a uniquely independent way. And can that voice be helpful for churches as churches are trying to figure out where they want to be and who and what they want to be into the future? So a sense of setting the vision, what our vision can be, the limitations to that vision. I see that as an obstacle, both for the seminary and for the church. So that would be one. The second would be, and it's connected with that, it's the identification of who we want to be equipping into the future. Who's going to be the student of the future in theological education? How do we sustain them? How do we help nurture them? How do we help them grow? How do we equip them so they're not financially destitute with overpowered by debt when they leave? How do we identify and then nurture that community of people who are called to go into theological education, to therefore go into leadership in some avenue related to the church? So I'd say those 2 obstacles. What's the church going to be like? And then who are the people we're going to call and train and teach? And
so those are the 2 obstacles. Give me your 2 answers.
Well, one of them, the creativity in terms of the curriculum, how we now rethink, and you've heard that today, how we rethink more inclusively what we're going to do as we teach. I think that can equip students better to help the church better in the future. And then how we resource these students, the kind of financial resources we bring, the kind of theological and material and psychological, spiritual resources we give to these students so that they'll be able to endure the rigors of theological education and then find a way to apply theological education once they get into the context they're going to be serving.
Okay. Dr. Folyd-Thomas, what do you think are the 2 biggest obstacles to theological education today, or say for the next 10 years, and what would be your 2 answers?
Much like Dr. Blount, I think the church and the academy are reflective in many ways, one against another, against the other. And I think that for the church first, I think the question needs to be, what are you selling and who are you saving? Right. And then for the academy, it needs to be, who are you serving and what are you soliciting? Because within theological education is reflective of the crisis within the church. As Dr. Warnock said previously, what it means to be in America is to mean that we have been born again over and over in the slaveocracy of civil religion, where we bow our heads to the president or the resident of the White House. And as Black people, we've put mind to heart in such a way that we were able to liberate ourselves. We literally risked our lives to be able to read the Bible for ourselves, to rightly divide the word of truth. And as a people, we have come this far by faith. But now, since the church has been infused and embedded with anti-intellectualism, and the academy has been anti-religious to the extent sometimes of soul murder, right? That you have people much like that father, right, with the possessed son in Mark saying, I believe, but help my unbelief. We have to know how to ask those questions that will help give answers in practical ways. It is a shame that the Emanuel 9 fell victim again, not only to Dylan Roof, but to our silence when there was an opportunity where the president of the United States comes and either how that sounded or what it means historically to choose that particular song for that particular moment. But here you have a Black denomination full of bishops behind him, but yet we have a Black denomination that has not written a position paper on gun violence or gun control.
Right.
The fact of the matter that we have the largest Black women's movement in the world happens to be the Black church.
Right.
But it is headed by listening every single Sunday for the most part.
Yeah.
We're not asking the critical questions about whose backs, right? Do we bend and break in order for our institutions to stand? And why are we serving the ghosts that still stalk us? Why are we serving that which is righteous as that which is just clearly wrong? We have inverted both within theological education and within the church. We are selling vices as virtues. We're selling sins as success. And we really need to ask to whom are we held accountable? Who called us and who keeps us in these institutions? And I think the attrition of both the church and the divinity school and seminary classroom are showing us, right? Are showing us those people who ultimately we're going to have to stand up to support. So I want to applaud in real ways the presidential leadership of President Blount and the prophetic vision of Rapheal, because the fact of the matter is, to go to seminary is to be broke.
That's right.
To get a PhD is to oftentimes snub your nose at the churches that allowed, who gave you the faith to help you believe that you can make it. And so we need more people and more people institutions that represent what they embody. So I thank you, Martha, for this opportunity. And I would really charge your work and even the work that we're doing, real internal audits of these divinity schools and seminaries, so we can actually make it plain to our preachers who are paying more for theological education than they're paying for their mortgage.
Yes.
Right? I know students who have more student debt than they have mortgage debt.
Yes. Yes.
And so we need to do the steward to do that discernment and say, these are the places worthy of your investment. And these are the places who are willing to write your ticket. Okay. So thank you for this conversation.
All right. Thank you all for doing it. And Dr. Warnock, we're going to close with you. So tell me your your two main key obstacles to the mission of theological education in the future or in the next 10 years, and your two answers. What do you think of the two big things that, and they may be hurting us now, or you may see them as obstacles to the future of those who want to serve the church in an intelligent way, and then give me your solutions.
Yeah, the seminary and the divinity school are in flux and in a crisis of mission and identity, like so many parts of the society. We're just living in a world of flux, and a lot of people struggling for what it means. You know, they knew what they did 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah,
we could be having the same conversation about our Baptist conventions, about all of our denominational gatherings, for that matter. This crisis in identity and mission in a moment like this. So that's the larger framework for the question, I guess. But just to kind of speak to this quickly in some very practical ways, I'll go back and say that this issue around costs is very important, and it's one that we'll have to keep working through. I want to encourage any of my colleagues who may be listening or watching or heard about this broadcast, if you haven't thought about hiring seminarians and putting them on your staff, do that. I mean, you don't know who you'll be training. You don't know what that person will go on to do, and make sure you hire men and women, that you hire diversity on that staff. And look, there's so many things that churches are called to do. Like there's this whole, we're on this online platform right now. Churches are wrestling with this whole idea around streaming and what does it mean to do ministry in a cyber world. Well, there's seminarians out there. They're young people and you know, not just young people, they're just people who are engaged, who understand technology, who can be helpful to the church,
right?
Help them. You know, there's with in so many ways. But we got to deal with this issue of cost, and on that score, I think people in theological education, presidents of seminaries, and deans have to be more thoughtful about the value that a theological education brings to the world in general, and the American situation,
right,
in particular, in the moment. For those of us who consider ourselves, I guess, a part of the Christian left, if you will, for lack of a better term, there is this disconnect again, this divide between folks who are focused. You know, a lot of times the folk who are focused on justice, the left very often seems allergic to religion, to its own demise,
right,
and feel that disconnect. But people who are thoughtful know that you really can't talk about change in the society without engaging people of faith, just on a practical score.
Right.
So the seminaries talk about what is the value you bring to the world. I think you want to think about who are the foundations, the high net worth individuals. What are the groups that want to fund change, transformation? And they probably, and many of them maybe have been dismissive of people of faith and institutions that train people of faith. I think the onus is on us to help them to see what they're missing. I mean, anybody, I mean, ironically, anytime, you know, folk talk about movement in America, they're not going to talk long without reference to the co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King. You're not going to talk long about movement in the 20th century, 21st century, without quickly talking about that movement. And at its heart, it was the church in the streets. It was people of faith standing up. So I know all the challenges and limitations that the church has at this moment, but there still is a case to be made for the role of religion in society, people of faith being agents of change in the world. And I think we have to be serious about preparing people for that. And I think that to the degree, I guess what I'm saying, I'm trying to say, I think what Jesus said in one sense, that if you seek to save your life, you'll lose it.
Amen. Amen.
If you would lose your life for my sake, if you give your life, seminary, if you give your life, church,
Yes.
over to something larger than self-preservation,
Yes.
you might actually.
That's right. That's right.
That's absolutely.
Just to the degree that we're insular.
Yeah.
And just focused on the hymn of the week and balancing the budget.
Yes.
We're always going to be struggling.
Yes. Yes.
But I think if we would take holy risks and walk out on a limb and really be, try to live out the meaning and mission of the gospel in the world, we might actually have a chance to survive. We may not look like we looked before. We probably don't need to look like that.
Amen.
But we'll have a shot. So the other piece related to this, I guess, is curriculum. I think we have to continue to engage that. There's this interesting disconnect. I'll say this. I think that people who trained or seminaries like the one I attended and others, they do a really great job in training you in how to think theologically. They bring these critical tools to bear about how to think about the faith, all of that. They don't do as good a job as a lot of our conservative counterparts in some of the basic practical things that are helpful to people trying to do ministry in the 21st century.
That's right.
So the conservative, they're when it comes to social media and technology and all of the things that it takes to think about, how to do ministry in this moment, branding, for lack of a better word. They're thinking about that. And so what I'm saying, they may have a lot to teach us on that score, even though the theology may be jacked up.
Right.
A lot of us have the theology right. A lot of us have the theology right, but we don't have a hearing because we thumb our noses to certain kinds of practices and skill sets that are necessary, absolutely necessary to get a hearing in the world of Twitter and Instagram. So
absolutely necessary.
So for whatever it's worth, I think the seminary president who figures out how to have a curriculum where people get serious, rigorous theological tools, the tools of rigorous inquiry on the one hand, and yet a curriculum that's not allergic to some of the things that I think some of us progressives are too quick to sort of dismiss, may be on to something. Progressives don't even write for the church.
That's right.
Think about that. We write about the church.
That's right.
Criticize.
Right.
Say the church is backwards. Well, what are you writing to help the church to think differently about who it is and what its mission is?
Well, one of the reasons that we do this broadcast, or that I do this broadcast, is so that people like you all, who I know care desperately about the church, can be heard.
Dr. Simmons, it's Kanye West said, I'm gonna let you finish. But I'll tell you, every time I get ready to teach a Bible study in my church,
yes,
or lead, some kind of series or engage in Christian education in my church, where am I gonna go? I have to write the stuff myself, because the things that resonate with me theologically, they're not in a format that you can easily take to those settings.
Right.
People who make stuff very accessible, that's not what you want to feed your people. If you equip them for the work of liberation and transformation in the world. And we've got to bridge that divide. And I think in as we pursue that, we might actually have a chance.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've been encouraging people to do is, you're going to do a D-Min, make sure that you can produce something that the church can use, and use it critically to do its work. Don't just get the degree so that we can call you by something different, but produce something critically that helps us in a critical way, that helps us do what we do. Other than that, you're just amassing debt and not helping yourself, not helping the church, not helping the church. There are so many other things that I want to ask this amazing group, but I am just so appreciative of their time. As I said, you know, we got a seminary professor who took the time to chat with us and whose school is paying the cost for a seminary education. I'm still stunned by that. I didn't know that. And let me tell you, you all are gonna get flooded after this broadcast. Oh, my God. I mean, Jesus. And then he's the president of the Association of Theological School. So hopefully some other people will really catch that. And then Dr. Stacey Folyd-Thomas, who, like I said, she's on leave. And she took the time to do this. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. And then to Pastor Warnock, I know this is your day off.
Yeah, you need to acknowledge that this is Preacher Monday and I'm working.
I know this is your day off. And I just so much appreciate your kindness and your sharing. Brothers and sisters, thank you again. This has been Dr. Martha Simmons with another session of Preaching and Preachers on Facebook Live. And as I always say, share the video. It won't cost you anything. Share the video. This is the kind of video that you want to do a watch party around. The seminary professionals, faculty, deans, you want to do a watch party. You want to do a watch party around this kind of a video. You really do. God bless. Have a great week. And the Lord says the same. We'll see you next Monday, noon Eastern Standard Time, for another session of Preaching and Preachers on Facebook Live. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Godspeed.